This is I Hear Things for Friday, May 7th, 2021. Where to find millions of new listeners today. This week is an enormous grab bag of joy, I have to say. We've got new research on podcasting and social media, the top 10 most recalled brands in podcasting, and some Clubhouse data that we're going to come out with. So, in fact, let's just go ahead and start there. First bit of news this week. We're going to unveil our first report on Clubhouse in just a couple of weeks. We've got an ongoing weekly tracking project at Edison Research called The Social Habit that continually surveys social media users to detect changes in behaviors and attitudes over time. A few months ago, we introduced the social audio platform Clubhouse into that mix. And after interviewing around 4,000 social media users over the last 3 months, we can finally produce a definitive look at the early adopters of Clubhouse, who they are, how they feel, how their usage of the service has changed over the last 90 days. Sneak preview, it's a bunch of dudes. Anyway, I'll be presenting all of this in a free webinar on Tuesday, May 18th, and I will drop a link to register for that into the show notes. It'll be good to finally have some solid demographic data around Clubhouse, and I am eager to get this out, as are my colleagues at Edison. All right, on with the rest of the show. The Accidental Podcast Listener. This week's main topic is fully credited to Brian Barletta, who edits the wonderful Sounds Profitable newsletter, and I'll drop a link to that in the show notes. And he wrote me last week with this question. I feel like everyone is sleeping on the impact Facebook can have on podcasting, especially with how much they keep insisting that they're going to go ahead and build their own player. I'm genuinely curious if the people who haven't yet listened to podcasts are also people who are actively on Facebook. Well, in the words of Casey Kasem, Brian, here's your long-distance dedication. This is an excellent question, especially in light of Spotify's recent announcement that you can now play music and podcasts, by the way, directly from your Facebook feed with Spotify's embedded mini player. A couple of years ago at Podcast Movement, I delivered a keynote that featured some new research we had conducted on rookies, or people that had discovered podcasting just within the last 6 months, and veterans who had been with the medium for 3 years or more. And I wrote a full recap of all of that on Medium. And again, I'll drop a link to that in the show notes. The data from that project suggested that the next wave of podcast listeners were going to be different to the core listeners that got podcasting to where it is today. Early listeners to podcasts were enamored with podcasting. They were intrigued by the medium, by the technology. They actively sought out recommendations. They actively sought out podcasts to listen to. Rookies, on the other hand, this new crop of people we've just been getting into the medium, they're more likely to encounter podcasts in the wild than they are to seek them out intentionally. My advice to podcasters at the end of that speech a couple years ago was simple. When it comes to finding new listeners, be where they are, live where they are, and love where they are. That meant not just cross-posting your podcast to YouTube, but actually posting a bespoke version of your show that was specifically made for YouTube or SoundCloud or Instagram or anywhere people might encounter your content in the wild. Some people took exception with this advice because, and I'll simplify here, it's too much work. Well, today, YouTube is one of the most important channels to discover new podcasts, maybe the most important, actually. Anytime people ask me, how can I grow my audience? How do I grow my listeners? I'll just start rattling off platforms and social media services, and I'll ask them, is your show content there, and is it there natively? If your content isn't everywhere that listeners can encounter it, there's some hygiene level work to be done before you worry about anything else. So back to Brian's question. To me, Facebook is the next great frontier for podcasters to explore. You heard me. Yes, you can share links to your show now, but having the ability for your show to play in Facebook, embedded by default, while users continue to scroll their feed, that's the behavior you're looking for. You might even ask for that specific behavior in the context of your podcast. If Spotify's mini player and potentially a native Facebook podcast player enables this behavior, well, there are a lot more Facebook users in America than podcast listeners. A lot more. Facebook truly could be the way to introduce podcasts to a segment of the population that doesn't even know what a podcast is, or whether they would even want to listen one if they did. So thanks to Brian's prompting, I took a look at an aspect of our recent Infinite Dial 2021 study, the study we put out every year with Triton Digital. We didn't report this, but it's super fascinating. One of my favorite questions in the social media section of the Infinite Dial is what we call the social P1 question, the social partisanship question. What social media service do you use most often? From the very first year that we started answering that question up until 2020, most people said Facebook. Facebook was the majority response here. In 2021, Facebook was no longer the choice of the majority, but it's certainly still the most popular platform amongst the plurality of social media listeners. 47% of social media users say that Facebook is the platform they use most. Instagram is second at 18%. And while younger internet users are spending more time with Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok, the mass that's at the center right of that age bell curve still overwhelmingly Facebook partisans. Of course, averages rarely tell the full story here, so I took a deeper look at these data. This time, I looked at the differences between monthly podcast listeners and those who have never listened to a podcast. The results, astoundingly clear. And I've put a link in the show notes to the newsletter version of this podcast, which has these graphs for you to use. Use all you want, we'll make more. When you look at the social media brand used often, you can see that podcasting's current audience is starting to leave Facebook behind. While 47% of social media users in general say that Facebook is the platform they use the most, with monthly podcast consumers, that number drops to 36%, with Instagram, TikTok, and Snapchat eating into Facebook's position at the top. So the total population at 47%, monthly podcast listeners, 36% say Facebook is what they use the most. Much of this is a trailing variable of age, by the way, with a lot of the growth in podcasting coming from 12 to 34s, and a lot of 12 to 34-year-olds leaving Facebook in droves. So that's influencing that number. But if you look at those who have never listened to a podcast, the people who have never listened to a podcast, that's over 40% of the population, by the way, 60% say Facebook is the service they use the most. 60%. Designing audio content for that group of people, they're a little older maybe, a little more likely to be late adopters of social media and technology platforms in general. That's the key to unlocking a massive new group of accidental podcast listeners. They may not think they're listening to a podcast per se, but they could certainly click on something to listen to while they scroll their daily feed. I honestly think there are tens of millions of new podcast listeners out there that could be found this way. The key to attracting them is to truly understand and empathize with them. This is the work of audience development, and it's a big part of what I do at Edison. So seeing this data, hearing this data, maybe you'll redouble your efforts to get your content on Facebook, yeah. But you might also consider what this untapped audience actually wants to hear. It might not be what you're doing right now, but it might be, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to edit that. We don't do that here. It might be what you do tomorrow. All right, next topic. Hello, Me Pillow Recruiter Scapable Spacify is on co. Yes, today we put out a new list of the top 10 most recalled brands in podcast advertising. This is an exciting addition to Edison's Podcast Consumer Tracker subscription product, and it adds brand recall to our comprehensive tracking of the entire podcast space. We threw in aided recall of some of the medium's top spenders as well, but the heart of this new addition is a simple question. What are the brands you remember hearing in the podcasts you listened to this week? And people just wrote them in, and we hand-coded them painstakingly. All of the pains were staked. The answers, I think, are not going to surprise you, and they shouldn't. They're really the people that have put the most into podcasting, certainly recently. The full list is available to subscribers, but I'll give you the top 10 here. The top 10 represent brands that I think have made a demonstrated commitment to podcasting. And those brands are, number one, at least in terms of recall, HelloFresh. Number two, Manscaped. Number three, BetterHelp, Audible, MeUndies, Squarespace, Geico, Spotify, MyPillow, and then tied for 10th, Amazon and ZipRecruiter. And I hope I just made a fortune from all of those companies just by naming them, right? Tell them I sent you. You can read more about this list and how the data was derived on the link that I'll pop into show notes. And by the way, you might be tempted to overlay that list with, say, the data that Magellan AI puts out, Find data on advertiser spend. And by the way, the data that I just read to you was from the first quarter of 2021. So first quarter of 2021, those are the most recalled brands. And as I mentioned, you might be tempted to overlay that with spending data, for example, like what Magellan AI puts out. But I wouldn't do that. First of all, some of the brands on this list have a long history of advertising on podcasts. Audible, for instance, they were one of the first, right? We've certainly observed a lag effect for the impact of podcast ads well after they have run. And also, advertiser goals differ. The amount of spend does not necessarily equate directly to reach, which is really what we're measuring here. We'll continue to track the unaided recall of brands and advertisers over the next coming quarters. And of course, aided recall of some brands for our agency clients. And you can look forward to quarterly updates of this top 10 list. I love something about that list, though. I love that it is a nice mix of direct response ads and brand advertisers. They both work. They're both vital to the complete picture of podcast monetization. So that's a little bit of new research. There's a couple of other tidbits in the newsletter this week. This is week 51 of the newsletter, and I had a think about that. And how many words I have written in the past year. And it's not necessarily relevant to this podcast, so we'll leave it at that. If you'd like to support this show, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com/Tom Webster. Your tips go to bandwidth, this podcast, and of course, coffee. Thanks so much for listening. That's been this week's episode of I Hear Things for May 7th, 2021. We'll see you next time.